All right, so welcome. It's the 9th of January 2021, and we have a special workshop sponsored by the ACA Healing Fellowship this morning. It's the 2021 New Year Step Workshop, how and why they work. This workshop is open to all 12-step programs. And as we begin this morning, we'd like to begin with the set-aside prayer. So anybody who would like to, you hopefully can have permissions to unmute yourselves, and we're going to put that up so that you can look at that right now while we say it together. Are you able to put that slide up for us, Steve, and I'll admit people?
Should be up. Oh, sorry, share.
Okay, we see it coming. So if those who would like to care to join me, God, today help me set aside everything I think I know about you. Everything I think I know about myself. Everything I think I know about others. And everything I think I know about my own recovery. So I may have
So I may have an open mind
and a new
and a new experience
with
with
all
all these things.
Please
Please help me to see the truth.
Thank you so much. Okay, so for some admin items before we introduce the speakers, we're part of the ACA Healing Fellowship. And what that means is there's a few meetings that have banded together to share a Zoom account. We're using that Zoom account today. And we're also part of the Santa Barbara, Ventura County and California Intergroup. So all the times we use our Pacific times. And so just as a note, we do have some meetings available if you're interested. We have a men's Touchstones to Recovery meeting on Wednesdays at 11 a.m. We have a Women on Wednesday or WOW meeting on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. We have a Thursday meeting at 7 p.m. We have a Freedom Friday meeting at noon. When COVID's not so active, we actually have a social distancing in-person meeting in Santa Maria, California at Waller Park at the gazebo. And we have a Serenity Sunday meeting at 4 p.m. So for muting, we have everybody muted today just to help with the recording. So if you need something, you'll need to use chat to get our attention. You can chat with Steve or I. Whenever you send a chat, it'll go straight to the hosts and co-hosts for the meeting. It won't go to anybody else. If you leave the meeting for any reason or doing anything disruptive, feel free to turn your video off if desired. And Steve and I are both your co-hosts today. So like I say, chat with us if you need help with something. So we'll show our schedule for today. You got kind of that schedule in the flyer, hopefully, but Steve, if you've got that, I'll go ahead and start admitting people while you put that slide up for the schedule so we could review that with people for just a moment. Okay, so here's our schedule for the day. Right now, we're obviously starting, and then we're going to kick off, introduce our speakers, and have steps 1 through 5 this morning. And then we'll have a short Q&A session before we take our lunch break. And that'll be from 11:30 roughly to 11:50 or so. And then from 12 to 1, we're going to take a lunch break, and we're going to open up the meeting room at that time so that anybody can chat, anybody can talk, you can unmute yourselves, whatever, during that hour-long period. And then in the afternoons, we'll come back and we'll review those steps 1 through 5 again and kick right off into steps 6 through 12. And we'll again have a Q&A session at the end of the day before we close out for the day. Thanks, Steve. So then the next thing for administrative items, we've got our 7th tradition. And if you would like to make a 7th tradition, 7th tradition states that every ACA group should be self-supporting, declining outside contributions. Money is used to pay for meeting expenses and support the ACA program as a whole. We are accepting donations via PayPal to the acahealing@gmail.com email address, and Abby B is our treasurer, so you'll see her name when you make that donation. Are there any questions before we introduce our speakers? And if so, you could raise your hand in the participants view. Let me scan and see. I'm not seeing any questions. Are you seeing any questions, Steve? No? Okay. All right. So then I think we're ready to get started. We'd like to introduce our speakers at this time. We'd like to welcome them. Thank you so much for helping us with this workshop today. First off, we have Father Tim with 41 years of recovery. He's a popular program speaker. He's a retreat leader and a workshop facilitator since 1990. He has been engaging in ministry to survivors of trauma since 2011. And then we also have Bob Kay with 32 years of recovery. He's presented workshops on the 12 steps, change, intimacy, and other topics since 1993 at conventions and conferences for AA, Al-Anon, CODA, and ACA. And with this, I'd like to turn things over to our speakers this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kim. My name's Tim. I'm powerless over alcohol, sex, love, and other drugs. Glad to be here. Raring to go. It's Saturday. I don't drink alcohol on Saturdays. Just a very short about me. I come from a really goofy family. Our family has been goofy for generations. And I have found that through the 12 steps, I can get relief and release from some of that goofiness. And that has been really, really a marvelous gift. I believe the 12 steps are the best program for me with regard to whatever's going on in my life. And I'm really grateful to be able to be here. I got sober when I was 23 and a half years old. I got into recovery from relationship stuff a year later. I started doing adult child recovery a year after that. And I have been doing recovery for the last 41 and a half years, almost and a half years. So I really believe in these programs. When I was 27 years into recovery, I thought one of the promises of the program is that we're going to be restored to sanity. And yet at 27 years sober, I joined the freaking army with no prior service at age 51. So I'm not sure that that's really a very sane thing to have done. But in any event, I survived for 13 and a half years of that, and am really grateful that the principles of the program work no matter where I am or what I'm doing, as long as I choose to engage them. I'm really powerless over my mouth, so I'm going to shut up and let Bob introduce himself.
Thank you, Tim. I'm Bob. I'm an alcoholic. I'm multiply addicted and also a recovering adult child of a dysfunctional family. It's really good to be here today. I got sober in February of 1988, and the steps were very important to me, and I felt like I was just on a mission, not wanting to do anything wrong and wanting to be integrated with everybody. And I finally managed to work through a very long process of getting my fourth step down on paper, feeling a lot of shame and guilt and having difficulty completing the process. And I did, and finished working the steps at about 14 months in recovery. At that point, I started feeling almost as squirrely and upset and dislodged as I had when I first got here. So the default for me was that I was doing something wrong. Thank God I had a really wonderful working relationship with a sponsor who, when hearing what I had to share, suggested that I might want to go to an Al-Anon meeting. So in May of 1989, I looked up in the meeting directory in Santa Clara County, found a meeting that was Al-Anon with ACA focus. I didn't have any idea what that was. I went to the meeting on a Tuesday evening, and and a fellow shared his story, and I could identify with it completely. I actually heard my story that was separated from my addiction story. So that began my journey in emotional sobriety and second stage recovery. And it was an entree into working the steps at a different and deeper level, and propelled me into a complete passion for step work and how important the steps are in reframing my life and the life of others. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Tim, and we'll get started with that oh so unbelievably difficult sometimes first step with powerlessness.
Thanks, Bob. So again, my name's Tim. I'm powerless over pretty much everything. I wanted to start off reading from Alatene's One Day at a Time book, because I can identify with what things used to be like. This is for January 9th. When I was younger, I had a personal idea of God, a higher power who knew my problems and was ready to help me. I didn't think of God every day, but I knew God was there whenever I needed God. Then, as the alcoholism in our home grew worse, I started to feel as if God had turned against me. I blamed God when things went wrong, when I had trouble with my schoolwork, and when my friends didn't understand why things in my home were different from theirs. The program helped me get back the feeling I once had for God. Instead of my old negative way of blaming God for my troubles, I can turn to God now for help. I don't always get what I ask for, but it's better that I don't. God knows better than I do what's good for me, and that's the way I like it. Things to think about. I make things harder for me when I block my higher power out. It's a lonely and scary feeling trying to work things out on my own. When I learn to trust and ask my higher power for help, things have a way of going a lot better. The program always gives me the choice, but I think I'll stick with my higher power in order to work my problems out with someone who cares. So that's January 9th from Al-Anon's A Day at a Time. Alatene's A Day at a Time. I think that it's serendipitous that the reading for today talks about a higher power, because my experience has shown me that unless I can identify the powerlessness of right now, I don't need a higher power. I don't need anyone because I'm just fine, thanks. And for me, as Bob can tell you, everything is always about what's the powerlessness of right now. Because if I can name the powerlessness du jour, of this present moment, I'm reminded that I have a program. I remember that the program works, and I am able to start engaging that program with regard to what the powerlessness of this present moment might happen to be. So what do I mean by powerlessness? Well, for me, if I feel angry, there's some powerlessness going on. If I feel afraid, there's some powerlessness going on. If I feel judgmental, there's some powerlessness going on. If my stomach is tied up in knots, there's some powerlessness going on. Get the picture? And unless I put into the context of powerlessness what I'm going through, I forget I have a program. And I've been doing this for almost 2/3 of my life. So I'm not sure what that says about me, except that there is hope in that. And the hope is, if I can name the powerlessness of right now, I'm reminded there's a program. I'm also reminded immediately, the AA program says, there is one who has all power. Tim is not it. At least that's what it says in my big book. And I don't know how I wound up with that one, but I thought, wow, this is pretty good. So I really encourage you to take a look at the last 24 hours and do a powerlessness inventory. So for example, one of the handouts that we have suggested, I'm going to get rid of the background because it doesn't allow me to show things, has 4 columns, the first of which is I'm powerless over. And what I would suggest is, in the last 24 hours, what was I powerless over? And then the powerlessness occasions unmanageability in my life. So what was the unmanageability that was connected with this powerlessness? I also like to recognize that if I didn't identify the powerlessness in the moment, I probably invited completely optional, unhealthy, unhelpful, unmanageability into the situation. So that's a good thing to take note of. And then I can ask, am I really powerlessness? Am I really powerless over this situation? Or do I have a choice? Is there something that I could do about this? So this is engaging the serenity prayer, the courage to change the things I can. And what happens when I choose the response to the powerlessness that I elect? What payoff do I get? Is my response to this powerlessness helpful? Or actually, does it set me up for more unmanageability than needs to be the case? What's the payoff? So I encourage people to keep it really simple and just do the last 24 hours. And if I'm honest, it's amazing how many areas in my life I can experience powerlessness in. You know, in traffic, even in the midst of the pandemic, about job stuff, about family stuff, about the weather, about my bank account. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in my life in which my powerlessness can really occasion a lot of unmanageability. And I've discovered that I'm addicted to adding unmanageability into situations that already have way more than enough to begin with. So yeah, I'm very powerless over alcohol. I'm powerless over my mouth. I'm way powerless over non-habit forming marijuana. I'm really powerless over other folks. I work in a children's hospital, and we are chock full of kids with COVID right at the moment. And the powerlessnesses associated with that I experience personally, not having enough personal protective equipment, for example, or that I experience vicariously by seeing parents, by seeing these kids. A lot of these kids are unable to contextualize their experience because they're either too young or they're too developmentally disabled. And I experienced that as an unbelievably painful powerlessness in my life. I'm so grateful that Al-Anon many years ago in Chicago began to teach me that Messiah is not part of my job description. But boy, that's painful, especially when I'm confronted with family members and other people whom I love who are doing things that contribute to their destruction. And if they'd only see things the way I see them, except they don't. And I am not able to change their experience of that. And I find that really tough. I think I can see that Bob is champing at the bit. So, Bob, please.
Well, thank you, Tim. Tim is my sponsor. And my first sponsor in AA died. He was 10 years younger than I, and he had a heart attack, an unknown congenital birth defect. And I was sent into a spiral of sadness and depression that was really hard to escape for a while. And when I got reconnected with Tim, one of the aspects of powerlessness that was so challenging for me, and other people that I share with seem to have a similar difficulty, we rightfully have better life experiences as we continue on the path of recovery. Some of us get married successfully. Some of us face relationship challenges that may not work out. Some of us have better jobs or even open our own businesses. And we begin to have experiences with living life on life's terms. My detachment from structured sponsorship was a really bad place for me to be, because I did not recognize this main ingredient of powerlessness that Tim has been talking about. Most of the first year that I worked with him, I would call him up, and he's a good listener. So I would talk about whatever was bothering me or irritating me, or perhaps a situation that I felt like I'd gotten myself into. And for the first 4 or 5 months, and through the first time I worked the steps all the way through with him, he would listen and have a lot of compassion. And listening is a really important part of being connected in our program, listening with an attempt to understand. After I had an anchor with him and I'd work through the steps and I would bring something to him, if I had repeated it, he would speak to me by pronouncing my name as if it was spelled B-A-H-B, Bab. You're dealing with powerlessness. To the point where I'd feel cranky sometimes just hearing that. And yet it's so true. I am powerless really over everything besides my choices. And this is why when Tim was alluding to the power of having that third and fourth column in step one for me, I need to make a determination when I'm choosing something that is not in my better interest. And then getting to the payoff can actually lead to an inventory all on its own, which becomes very helpful. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Bob. Now, for people who are struggling with, well, the first step doesn't really make much sense to me. My first sponsor, Gil, who died with 30 years sober, used to say to me, Tim, if the drinking causes problems, the drinking is a problem. And what's really great about that is, if this relationship causes problems, this relationship is a problem. if this drug taking causes problems, if this eating causes problems, and that's what powerlessness is about for me, is that I wind up with more problems than I already have if I don't confront the powerlessness for what it is. And I'm really grateful that this program is a 12-step program and not a 2-step program. That is to say, it's not just the first step and the 12th step. The first step says, think the F word. Then the 12th step says, come join us. So by concentrating on what's the powerlessness of right now, I can choose not to invite completely optional unmanageability into a situation that has way more than enough, almost certainly. And then I can remind myself I need a really humongous higher power. And I'm very grateful to have gotten that through my thick skull. Because if I'm not powerless, my broken brain tells me I'm just fine, thanks. And that's a bad place for me to be, because it says I can do this on my own. And my best thinking got me really messed up. So again, I encourage you to do an inventory looking at areas of powerlessness in your life just over the last 24 hours that in the moment you didn't recognize, oh, what's going on here is powerlessness. And then take a look at what happened subsequent to not identifying that powerlessness for what it is. I'd be willing to bet you did not engage steps. My life goes better when I engage steps. So I hear my ancient clocks chiming. I don't know if you can hear them, but I think that that's probably enough about step one, because I'm going to be talking about step one throughout this whole thing today. So perhaps, given that we're powerless over a short amount of time in which to cover all 12 steps, I'm going to defer to Bob and his wisdom, experience, and strength, and have him discuss step two.
Thank you, Tim. Well, when I came to the second step the very first time, I was so grateful to have the kind of structure that I did in sponsorship. And my experience with structure is that I come from a segment of people. I think we as people in recovery may be the most active in our thinking about not being or not liking being told what to do. I know that applies to me. I came in here with absolutely a complete brokenness. Anne Lamott calls it the gift of desperation. And I had no way of knowing how my life had become so tangled and literally destroyed. I could get to the powerlessness over the specific problem that I brought in and the unmanageability. So that first step list for me was very easy. And the unmanageability was hard to look at, and it brought forward feelings of shame and guilt, which are really uncomfortable. So my sponsor at the time, Tom Olson, talked to me about there were 7 processes in the second step. I had never heard that before in any step meeting that I'd gone to. Of course, I was new. And that the second step was completely chock-a-block full of promises. And because I had a belief system that said I was going to get everything wrong, I really wanted to be sure that I got things right, things correctly. So first we come into the program, it means that we got here, we arrived. So I am now outside of the comfort zone I was living in. And whether it has addiction to substance or addiction to people or addiction to shame, whatever that addiction might be, I needed to get into a position where I was going to be able to change the narrative. I didn't know this at the time. There's an author who wrote a book mostly familiar with AA called A New Pair of Glasses. He talks about the recovery process being uncover, discover, discard. I like that a lot. So I have to be able to come into a different situation. And then by doing so and going to meetings and picking a sponsor, I began to come to. I began to wake up to some new thought processes. I was given an opportunity to not operate in the same way that I had been operating, where I thought a drink or a drug or sugar, food, other things would fix me at some level or take care of me. Then I needed to have a belief system. Because of my drinking history and my behavior history, I thought that life was going to need to be managed by self-sufficiency. It's part of what happened to me in my survival mode and aspect in my early childhood in recovery. Many of us don't identify with having problems in childhood, but at some time or another, whenever acting out behavior started to become unhelpful in our lives and began to create situations where we were making decisions that weren't in our better interests, a pattern began to form that we were doing the right thing, quote unquote. And eventually, Tom Weston talks about our disease being first fun, then fun plus problems, and eventually nothing but problems. So when I get to that phase of having nothing but problems, I do not have self-reliance anymore. So what am I going to believe in? And the consistent meeting attendance first gave me the feeling that I had a group of drunks or a group of dependents. GOD became palatable for me because I wasn't running on self-sufficiency. So that's the third premise. And then it began to become easier when I was speaking with my sponsor and having coffee after the meetings and so on, to know that there was something there that was outside of myself that was definitely a power greater than me. And I could listen in meetings to people talking about going to the ocean and sitting by the ocean and reflecting that the ocean could give them a sense of power at a different level that was not yet a concept which some people call God, yet a power outside of themselves. And what is possible for this power to do? Could, meaning something different than my own comfort zone, which I had been creating on my own for many, many years, might come into play. And what would that power be able to do? Restore, bring back to a position where I had sanity or healthy and sound thinking. Early workshops that I went to, I saw a speaker describe it like this: when we're born, our insides and our outsides match perfectly. When we come out of our mother's womb, we're hungry, we need food, we need love and nurturing. So there's a movement away from that center point. And hopefully, as infants, we do get love and nurturing. There's a lot of studies out about fetal alcohol syndrome babies, or heroin babies, crack babies, neglected babies. And when we have any of those impacts in our lives, or as needs are not being met, we begin to separate, and that gap between our insides and our outsides matching gets further and further and further apart. So at that point, recovery, when we are fortunate enough to get into recovery, I was taught that recovery is a process to get that moved back more toward the center. So our insides and our outsides are matching, which is the part that is being restored, brought back to a level of sanity. That's pretty powerful for a message of the second step. So I was given an assignment, which is on the second step worksheet, where I was asked to identify what is God, or what is a higher power to me. And the exercise is to take plenty of time to do that. Be quiet, let those answers come from inside, and to thoroughly go over anything that comes to my mind about what God may be. Put that list under my pillow. That was the first way that I did it. And then look at it the next day and see if there's anything to add to it. Then the process of the second step, the second process of the second step is to write down what God is not. And that was a good exercise for me, because there was so much fear involved in my movement away from what I had learned in my childhood. I did grow up in a religious background. One of the problems that I had was I felt that God was not a lot of things, because what I heard about in my religious upbringing didn't have anything to do with the way that our household was being managed. And that was really difficult, because as kids, our parents are our higher power. And many people in other programs outside of AA and NA and Al-Anon find that as they're dealing with problems with dysfunctional family issues and so on, that they may have protected family members, because for me, I just didn't want to believe that things were tough in my young life. And when alcohol came along and drugs came along, I didn't even have a realization that sugar and food had happened earlier to come along. Those would help manage those feelings temporarily until they didn't manage them anymore. So I need to have the identification both of what God is and also what God is not. And the only time that I have been guided in my recovery to dispose of any writing that I do is when I have taken thorough and complete time to write down what God is and what God isn't. And then to take scissors, or to take and tear, fold and tear off what God is not, because I don't need that list anymore. And Tim has got terrific information about how to make our higher power expand. This is something that I didn't have much thought about until I got back into having repeated powerless situations. And he might say something to me like, "Bob, you need to make God bigger." So you want to elaborate a little bit on that, Tim?
Thanks, Bob. So years ago, I was in the car with the fabulous Father Tom W., lately of the People's Republic of Berkeley. And we were driving from the Bay Area up to Seattle for the AA 55th birthday party. And we were in the middle of nowhere driving. There was nothing on FM radio, and the only things on AM radio were basically talking heads. And I got really mad at something, and Tom looked over at me and he rolled his eyes and he said, "Oh, Tim, your higher power is way too small." And I'm quite frankly surprised, shocked even, that you seem not to be aware of this. And so I gritted my teeth and I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, Tim, your higher power is way too small because your higher power hates all the same people you do." Ugh. So from that moment, in the summer of 1990, I put my higher power on a workout program that included steroids. And I've come to learn that the bigger my higher power gets, the more fearlessly I can approach my life. And the proof of that in my life, so this was 1990, I was with Tom, and he said that to me. In 2008, I went to Iraq without a weapon in the middle of a war. And I, who not only don't like war movies, there I am starring in one, and I also don't like roller coasters. And as it turned out, I had 189 missions via helicopter. And way too often the helicopter would do this or it would do that. And I'm not hooked into the comm system, so I don't know what's going on. But especially when the flares go off, there's a good chance we're under attack. And so I don't like roller coasters. And I'm on this aircraft that's doing, I like to say, acrobatics rather than evasive maneuvers. And the only way I could have wound up in that situation is if between 1990 and 2008, I had stayed sober and working 12 steps, and B, I had demanded that my higher power get bigger and bigger and bigger. So if the concept of God is too much, I learned on my third overseas deployment that God for me had to mean gratitude or death. It was a deployment that should have been easy, and it wound up for me being an experience from the pits of hell. And I realized if I could not access gratitude in the midst of adversity, I was going to drink. And if I drink, I'm going to die. So I really believe that having done a searching and fearless moral inventory of my higher power, finding out what God is, what God isn't, and for me, finding out, is God big enough to handle the challenge of Tim, was really important. Because as I said, the bigger my higher power gets, the bigger I demand my higher power get, the more fearlessly I can do my life. And when I was a kid, I was terrified of everything. And so to experience freedom from fear, and I think Bill Wilson said the core of every alcoholic is fear, self-centered fear. To experience freedom from fear is a great gift of my higher power. Bob?
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, one of the things that still is true for me today, I wish it weren't so, is that my number one nemesis when I get into any sort of difficulty is that the world and people in it are not behaving the way I want them to. And when that happens, of course, it's an immediate piece of powerlessness. And the issue around that is that unless I have a position with my higher power and I can make my higher power bigger, then somehow, some way, I am going to default into trying to control a situation at some level or create a way to change it. And that is just not happening. So that's pretty much what I have on step 2. I think we're rolling along.
Bob,
Yeah.
if I might, one of the things that my first sponsor, Gil, had told me early on in my recovery was, if you're having trouble with a higher power, the concept of a higher power, Tim, borrow mine. And I thought that was stupid. I didn't know what the hell that meant until I realized my higher power was way too small. And I needed to borrow the higher power from someone who was working a program who I admired. And the way I did that was I asked myself, what would Mary's reaction be in this situation? I know she has a really humongous higher power. And then I needed to act as if my higher power were, in fact, up to the challenge of handling Tim. And over the course of years, that eventually worked. And so if you're having a difficulty with the notion of a higher power, I encourage you to borrow the higher power of someone you respect, someone who has what you want. And the way to do that, at least for me, the way to do that was to ask myself, what would Mary's reaction be? Then what would her response to the situation look like? And that's what I then would choose for myself, to act as if I had Mary's higher power. And it worked. I don't know how that happens, but I know that it has happened for me.
And just the last thought from me, here's the list now that is only what God is. Every one of us have had breakthroughs at some level or another, where we've walked through things and faced challenges. Sometimes I'll hear people in meetings say, if you're living in fear, then you don't have faith. That is not my experience. I've walked through a lot of different things because I've had faith, or because I've had experiences that the walkthroughs have worked and I haven't imploded. And then that is a sign for me to be able to add to my higher power, even if I can't identify or know what that higher power is, which might be a good segue to turn this back over to Tim.
Okay, so for me, as I've said, it's always all about powerlessness. On the 2nd of November, 2004, it happened to be a presidential election day, though that had nothing to do with anything. I had celebrated 25 years sober the previous September. And instead of doing 90 meetings in 90 days to end at my sober birthday, I didn't start my 90 meetings in 90 days. until the 1st of August, when I got back from having been in Asia all summer. I was not sure that I could do 90 meetings while I was in Asia. So that meant that I finished 90 meetings in 90 days on the 31st of October that year. On the 2nd of November, I had just gone in for my first day at work in a new job. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, an hour after getting there, I'm on the phone hearing my younger sister say to me, TJ killed himself this morning, our younger brother. My very first thought was, this is an F of a lot of powerlessness. My very second thought was, I have a really humongous higher power. And I'm grateful that that for me is an instance of one of the promises of the AA program coming true, that we will intuitively know how to handle situations. And I knew that the way to handle that situation was that I needed to turn my life and will, and indeed TJ's life and will, over to the care of a really humongous higher power. The third step says, well, let me just back up one little bit. The second step talks about a power greater than ourselves that can restore us to sanity. And for me, I like to talk about the fact that in the first step, my higher power's job is to have all power. And that's why I'm powerless. In the second step, the higher power's job is restoration. And in the third step, made a decision to turn will and life over to the care of the higher power. My higher power's third job is care. And that's really important, because when I was little, I didn't feel care. And another spiritual awakening I had many years later was that my brain had processed that to mean that there was no care there. In hindsight, after doing some recovery stuff, I realized there was care there. It wasn't according to my script. And arguably, it wasn't what I needed, but there was care there. And I get the opportunity to make a decision to allow what's true to be sufficient for right now. That is to say, I can practice being satisfied. So, made the decision to turn will and life over to the care of the higher power. I am not only addicted to adding unmanageability into situations that have way more than enough to begin with, I'm addicted to turning my will and my life over to the non-care of lower powers. And so that's my default setting. Even 40 years into recovery, my default setting is I will automatically choose lower powers rather than the care of a higher power if I'm not working steps from the beginning. So if I can understand, oh, I'm feeling enraged right at the moment, that's because there's some powerlessness going on. I need to recognize I get to have a really humongous higher power big enough to handle whatever the occasion for this rage might be, and I have the freedom to make the decision to choose for a really humongous higher power rather than to claim victimhood and move toward the lower powers. When I was in the depths of my sex and love addiction, it was all about victimhood for me. And in fact, I was choosing that, which is not really sane. And so making the decision to turn will and life over to the care of a really huge higher power is a lot easier if I'm convinced that my higher power is in fact big enough to handle me, big enough to handle this situation. One of the challenges of coming from the goofy family that I came from is that if I made a decision, it might be the wrong one. And then, oh my God, look out for the shame. So one of my responses was, well, I'll just try never to make a decision, which is a decision. So that's not helpful. A lot too has to do with when I was a kid, the higher power of my childhood looked a lot like mom and dad in a funhouse mirror. Distorted, scary, ever-changing, unreliable, not really a very helpful notion of a higher power. So making a decision was itself a challenge. And then the decision to turn will and life over becomes hugely challenging if I have this notion that the higher power is out to get me and is just waiting to zap me into eternal damnation. That's not a loving higher power, that's a monster. And I'm really grateful that through the program and through allowing myself to be loved in the midst of the mess that I am and have made and have become, I've come to an experience of God as being grace overcoming despair. And if that's my experience of a higher power, it becomes a lot easier to act on the decision to turn will and life over to the care of this really huge higher power whose third job after having all power and being about the business of restoration, my higher power's third job is care. And one of the real sadnesses of the damn pandemic is that I haven't been hugged in the better part of a year. And I need that kind of appropriate physical contact as a connection with care. So again, for me to be able to make a decision to turn will and life over to the care of this higher power, I have to have been working step one to remind myself I need a higher power. And then step two, oh, I get to have this really humongous higher power who's about restoration rather than condemnation and punishment. And then I can make the decision to turn will and life over to the care of God. And you know that the step actually goes on, God as we understood God. And as I like to say, I have more degrees than a rectal thermometer, several of them in theology and philosophy, and I don't understand God. So for me, it's turn the will and the life over to the care of a God of my non-understanding. I have a very powerful intellect, but it's located in a broken brain. And that's a really dangerous combination. So for me to try to understand God is almost certainly an attempt on my part to try to control. Because one of the survival mechanisms I engaged when I was a kid to stay alive in this goofy family was that I retreated into my intellect. And I convinced myself that if I could just understand something, I wouldn't feel as afraid. And as I see now, that was me telling myself that if I can understand it, I can control it. And that is not a healthy place for Tim to go. So making the decision has been a challenge, and it's possible these days, as long as I'm working the first two steps, to turn will and life. And one of the great things I've gotten from Al-Anon and related 12-step programs is that I can make the decision to turn the wills and lives of people around me over to the care of my really humongous higher power. When I was in college, I never, ever stayed up all night studying. I lost track of how many nights I stayed up worrying. That was one of the gifts of growing up in a goofy family, was the way we express love is by how much do we worry about someone. And my worry was not helping anybody, least of all me. And so what I've learned is if I see someone who is engaging behaviors and attitudes that are extremely unhelpful, I can turn their will and life over to the care of my higher power. And that's one of the ways I work the third step in terms of relationships. And the way I do that is that I say the serenity prayer. God grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change things I can, wisdom to know the difference. And then I say AA's third step prayer. God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and do with me as you will. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I might better do your will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of your power, your love, your way of life. May I do your will always. And then the AA seventh step prayer. My God, I offer myself to you to build with me and do with me as you will. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I, oh, wait, is that right? Yeah, relieve me of the, no. Why am I having Bob, help me here. I'm having a senior moment.
My creator.
Oh, my creator, I'm now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defective character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my sisters and brothers. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. So I say that prayer for myself along the lines of being on an airplane. They say when the masks come down, put your own on first. Then I say those three prayers again, and I substitute the other person's name. God, grant Kevin serenity to accept the things he cannot change, courage to change the things he can, wisdom to know the difference. And then, God, I offer Kevin to you to build with him and do with him as you will. Relieve him of the bondage of self that he might better do your will. My creator, I'm now willing that you should have all of Kevin, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from him every single defect of character. So, and then I say those prayers again a third time in the first person plural. God grant us serenity to accept the things we cannot change. God, I offer us to you to build with us and do with us as you will. My creator, I'm now willing that you should have all of us, good and bad. And sometimes I will repeat that over and over again for the same person, or sometimes it'll be a whole list of persons. So I wind up doing a lot of praying, which is anticipating the 11th step, but we'll get there later. Anyway, so Bob, why don't you chime in here if you'd be so kind?
Okay, thank you, Tim. One of the things that happened with me when I got to step 3 was that everything just opened up. I felt this sense of serenity and peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I'd had a couple of things that were unexplainable to me that I could say were spiritual experiences or spiritual awakenings. And the good news about that is that I had them and I continue to have them. The difficult news was that then the movement into the 4th step was the next thing to do. And I was really reluctant to get into that. When I first started talking about this with my sponsor, he said that one of the pitfalls of steps 1, 2, and 3, if you don't have guidance and a helpful push to get busy with the rest of the steps, in the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book, once we've worked step 3, the next sentence is next we launched. Doesn't say a week from Tuesday or later, or I'll put this off just for a little while because I know it's going to be challenging. It says next we launched. So he told me that there's something called 3-stepping. And if you become a 3-stepper and do 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, you'll get relief. You might even add a 4th process to that, which is being helpful to others, but it won't propel you into changing the narrative, which is why moving on through the steps is so important. Then he went on to say that step 3 is not actually about turning things over. That comes in 6 and 7, which we'll discuss later. It's making a decision, this decision that is perhaps the most important decision that I ever made, because at that point, I really have an awareness of my powerlessness. I know that I need restoration. I know that my own best thinking got me into the program, thank God. And I know that if I trust guidance and I don't run things on my own, that I have a much better chance than I did before. So the language of step 3 made a decision to turn my will and my lives, because they're multiple, a lot of things going on in this brain, over to the care of a higher power is just an amazing process. I looked up some information about the history of how the steps were written. Of course, they're part of the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book. And Bill actually began to write the steps in 1938. So he is sober somewhere around 2 years when that happens. And the first draft came out in 1938. And he wrote it in New York and in Newark. One of the things that I actually cherish about sponsorship and about connection and integration is that Tim and I were in New York at the same time a few years back, and we went to Stepping Stones, which is the home of Bill and Lois. It's in Bedford Hills, New York. And if you ever get a chance to go back there, you can actually go into Bill's workshop and sit at Bill's desk where he wrote the big book in New York and New Jersey. And then later when they bought that home, the desk was moved there, and that's where he wrote the 12 and 12. It was a wonderful experience for me. I have that picture in my phone, and every once in a while when I forget I need connection, I'll come across that picture, and it gives me a good memory process to stay connected. So if I am now going to get connected into the next process, here comes the challenge of step 4. And the first, Tim, did you want to say anything more about step 3 and close that off?
I was wondering if we needed to take a short break because we've been at this for almost 2 hours. So I also realized that we only have another 45 minutes till we're supposed to break for lunch. So I'm not sure. Why don't we take a 5-minute break? Would that be okay?
Sounds good.
Okay,
Yeah.
5 minutes. I'm going to start, even if Bob isn't here. We've come to expect that of him. I wanted to, oh, well, there he is. Hello, Bob. So we're going to start, we're going to romp through steps 4 and 5 now, correcto mundo? All right. Take it away, Bob.
Okay, so thank you, Tim. So step 4, one thing that I remembered that I forgot to do before we started the presentation is to say that we're going through the steps, how and why they work. And our goal is to be able to make possible an understanding of the mechanics of steps so that it's helpful for everybody irrespective of what program you're bringing here today, you come to us with. None of this information is meant to suggest that anyone is doing anything but whatever work you are doing perfectly, because the important thing is that we work steps, that we take steps is a better way to say it. And with that, I'll also say that I sponsor people in a number of different programs. And before I will use the program du jour, because I have taken and worked steps and have sponsorship and sponsor in NAAA, Al-Anon, and ACA, and have done so in CODA. Each time we come to this process of the 4th step, the first go around through the steps is always, that's a big word, always done the way that they were initially written in the AA Big Book. One of the reasons for that is that it was extremely difficult for me to get to the 4th column in the inventory as it's laid out in the AA Big Book. And if those of you who have the step 4 worksheet, or if you're familiar with how the 4th step is done in the AA Big Book, we work out where our resentments are, and those are for people, places, and things. When I went through the steps for the first time, there was no mention that I might want to put myself on the resentment list. And yet, isn't it interesting that the difficulty that comes for many of us about doing a 4th step is because when shame and guilt pop up, it brings up feelings. And sometimes those feelings are extremely challenging. I would have periods of time when I put the pen to paper to begin with, where I would break into tears and I would sob like I had whooping cough, and I just didn't want to write anymore. And I didn't want to think about or feel those feelings, or I would say out loud, I am in so much pain, and I'd wail and moan to my sponsor, and I would get care and loving support and a push to continue to move forward and put the pen to paper. So in the fourth step, I can get to what is happening with me on a feeling level by using the term or the concept of resentment. Now, initially, it may be easier to understand the yous in my life, like you did this to me or you did that to me, therefore I hate you, or worse. Or it could be an institution, it could be an organization, it could be even a concept. Whatever it could be, what is it that I'm resentful about? And the process can be made very simple. It's just to make a list. I am resentful at. This document was actually created by a man that I sponsor. He wanted to simplify the process for himself. So he put each resentment down, the individual, and then he would spend some time writing out the cause. And then what was the effect on him? I am resentful, not very often, but let's say I'm resentful at my life partner, Beth. I don't think that she is contributing enough to the work around the house. This is not correct. I'm being hypothetical. What does that affect? Well, it affects my personal relations. It quite easily could affect my sex relations. It definitely affects my ambition at some level. What's my piece of the action in this? Well, that can shift and change over time. So as Tim talked about in step one, it's about being current. So do I have an expectation that she should be doing all the housework? That's an unreasonable expectation. That would be my piece of the action. Oftentimes, I will need a completely separate piece of paper when I'm doing my piece. Because the more I take responsibility for what happens on my side of the street, the better off it is. But what about if I'm resentful at myself? If I got messages, which I did as a kid, that I was never going to amount to anything, or that I didn't get it right, whatever it was, I could easily get mad at myself for not getting it right. And so when I dig into that part of the fourth step inventory, it's important for me to look at myself and be honest with myself about what kind of pressure I'm putting on myself. This is a connection to that third and fourth column in the first step, where I can realize that I have a choice in something. And what's the payoff? Well, I spent a very great deal of my young life playing a victim role. And because I was an invisible child in my family of origin, I didn't get much recognition without acting out. And when I got into my adolescence and my young adulthood, I didn't realize that behavior that was connecting to my drinking and using was recognition oriented. And whether or not my behavior was something that was healthy, functional, conducive, integrated to the people I was with was irrelevant because I was running the show. So this part of the fourth step is incredibly useful to be real about. Again, this goes back to what Chuck Chamberlain talks about. The process of our recovery is to uncover, discover, and then ultimately discard those things that are not useful. So when I am working with a sponsee today, or when I'm seeking guidance from Tim, I'm happy when I get questions from him about the thoroughness of my participation in anything having to do with resentment, whether it is about someone else or about myself. And the more that I can look at that and stay present with feeling the feelings, which is one of the hard parts, the better equipped I am to understand that because I am in this process of working the step, I am doing the work to move on, to cast it aside. Tim?
The fourth step in the big book is, I believe, one of the most spiritual of the steps. Now, some people say, well, step 3 is a spiritual step and step 11 is a spiritual. I think they're all spiritual steps. The fourth step is my opportunity to put on my higher power's glasses so that I can come to see myself the way my higher power has always seen me, so that I can come to love and accept myself the way my higher power has always loved and accepted me, which is right in the midst of the mess and not in spite of it. And the resentment aspect, I mean, in the AA Big Book, Bill is really clear. He says resentment shuts us off from the sunlight of the spirit. So resentment is a spiritual experience, but to use sort of contemporary parlance, it's of the dark side. And I need to get beyond resentment. So the list that Bob's sponsee made up for him is really helpful in terms of working the fourth step as given in the AA Big Book. I am really, really grateful that the only wrong way to do the fourth step is not to do it. My first fourth step, as it turned out, was search less and fearing, which I don't recommend. And I know that it was search less and fearing because it made no mention whatsoever of my sex and love addiction. And I'm really grateful then that in the program, anything worth doing is worth doing badly, as long as I don't revert to my addictive behaviors, attitudes, actions, whatever. I can go back and do it again. And I'm really, really grateful that the next time I did a fourth step, it was according to the Al-Anon Blueprint for Progress, which in retrospect, I learned was actually a business inventory with regard to personal stuff. And that's important to me because in the program, that is to say the first program, AA, after Bill writes, this was step 4, he says, a business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. Taking a commercial inventory is a fact-finding and a fact-facing process. It's an effort to discover the truth about the stock in trade. One object, not the only object, one object is to disclose damaged or unsaleable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. So uncover, discover, discard, as Bob has been talking about. I really believe that after doing the resentment inventory, it was really important for me to go back and do a business inventory, a commercial inventory, because now this is just my opinion, but because it's mine, it's correct. In the 5th step, the 5th step says, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. But Bill Wilson never tells us how to determine the exact nature of our wrongs. And the way I have learned to find the exact nature of the wrongs is to do a business inventory. That is to say, to look at not just what's broken and unsaleable, to use Bill's term, but the rest of the stock in trade, the assets. Because I have learned that if my higher power created me to be an asshole, then my being an asshole is not a character defect. So I can do a resentments inventory and not determine that I have the ability not to be an asshole. And so I'm really grateful then that we can approach inventory from a variety of different ways, and that what works at any given time can shift over time. So as I said, my first 4th step was completely searchless and fearing. And that's because I hadn't really done the 3rd step, because I hadn't really done the 2nd step, because I really hadn't gotten what the 1st step is really all about. And if I can recognize the powerlessness of right now, come to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us, whoever that us is, to sanity, to wellness, to wholeness, to integrity in the midst of that present powerlessness. And then I can make this decision to turn will and life, my own and that of those of other people, over to the care of a really humongous higher power. I get to put on God's glasses so that I can come to see what's really going on here, what my part in it is, and what my options are. And how that happens, in my experience over the last 40 years, is that it changes. And I'm so glad that the fabulous Father Tom pointed out to me the ancient spiritual principle that says, go where you're fed. And I can be fed through working 12-step programs in a variety of different contexts. And again, my experience has shown me that there need not be any competition or antagonism among 12-step programs because they all come from the same source. And when I can do a business inventory and find out that my higher power endowed me with the ability to be kind and generous and thoughtful and loving and filled with compassion, capable of joy, then seeing what an asshole I've been really occasions ego deflation at depth in me. And it allows me to recognize that I get to have a higher power who, having endowed me with all this wonderful stuff and who's seen me basically ignore it, deny it, stomp on it, urinate on it, whatever. My higher power loves me, cherishes me in the midst of that mess, and doesn't just put up with me in spite of it. Because the spiritual awakening that rivals pretty much all the rest in my life was that if I have a higher power who only tolerates me because my higher power loves me in spite of what's going on, what I've done, who I've become, etc., that's not really love. I get to have a higher power who cherishes me in the midst of the mess. And that blows my mind. And it really rocked my world spiritually and in terms of my recovery. And it wasn't until I got to see the exact truth about the stock in trade. Because the reason my first 4th step was search less and fearing, not only because I hadn't worked the first 3 steps, but it's because I really believed that I was lower than whale shit on the bottom of the ocean. And I was also afraid that I was going to come up with some information my higher power didn't already have. So that's definitely diagnostic for a too small higher power, that, you know, for a lower power. And so I get to have a higher power who cherishes me in the midst of the mess. That means there's nothing I could ever do to make my higher power either stop loving me or love me less than I'm loved right now. And that's amazingly wonderful for me. And it really helps my recovery. Okay, Bob.
All right, so now on to the next phase of step 4, which is a fears list. This is stated so simply in the big book, yet I have found it to be just a huge deal. It took me a few inventories to begin to really get down to the nitty-gritty of some of my fears. Some of them were pretty basic when I came in and I knew what they were. But after I'd gone through the steps for the first time, I started having some awarenesses like, I heard a prayer in my childhood that I was instructed to recite every night. And it went, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Well, because I had painful experiences in my growing up, my upbringing, I didn't realize how horrified of death I was. So that prayer was not helpful. And one of the aspects of my own craziness is, to this day, I still like to have noise to go to sleep. radio, TV. I've always thrived in areas where there was noise because it kept me alert, awake, and in the now. Not very conducive for step 11 meditation stuff. It was really hard for me to get quiet for a very long time. So I needed to know about that fear. It also took me a couple of inventories to get down on a fears list that when I was in 3rd grade, I was in the toilet in elementary school and I was sitting. And some 6th graders came in and they mocked me and made fun of me. And I was horrified about going to the bathroom in public places to the point that I rarely did it until I got into recovery. What was a consequence of that? Well, one of the consequences was that I had diverticulitis in my 20s because I would not do what was a normal bodily function. And that's really crazy. I mean, that needed to be restored to sanity. So these are examples of things that I had to get down on paper. And no fear that I have is minimal. So I shouldn't minimize it. It's really critical for me to get it down on the list so that when I'm communicating this sort of thing with my sponsor, when I'm doing the 5th step, then I can get pushback to say, tell me more about this. Something that is really important to me when I'm talking to Tim about something that I uncover, because I had no idea that there was shame connected to that second example. And it does say in the AA Big Book that resentment is the #1 killer of alcoholics. My experience is that shame is the #1 killer for me. I have to get rid of carried shame because it's not useful in any way. If I am chastise is a strong word, Tim, but if I get pushback from Tim in any way, it's when I'm beating myself up. He will not put up with that for me. And when I first started working with him, I had a lot of fear about getting connected with another sponsor because I had mumbo jumbo running around in my life that if I picked a sponsor, he might die. That was all connected to abandonment stuff. So it was interesting that I would not seek a sponsor in my primary program, though I had sponsors in the other programs that I was working. So it wasn't like I was not connected, but I did not have the original connection, which I have today. So a fears list can be something that's simple. You jot down fears on a yellow pad. Just like in that second step list, put it under your pillow. Add to it until you don't have it anymore. And then you'll be equipped with something to share. And it can be added to as time goes on. Sometimes the fear will go away for 1 element, 2 elements, 3 elements that might be on the list, examples on the list, they might come back. So then it's good for me to be listing them again, authentic, in the now, being present with what's actually going on. So fears list, a simple thing to do, and for me, a necessary thing to do. Now, the sex inventory in the AA Big Book doesn't have anything to do with what kind of sex I had, how often it was, or anything like that. It talks about how I was with other people in my sex life. And it was suggested of me to trace that back all the way to its very, very beginnings. So on page 69 in the AA Big Book, we stay out of, let's see, we do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex contact. We all have sex problems. We hardly be human if we didn't. What can we do about them? We reviewed our own conduct over years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom had we hurt? So in my behavior from the very first kiss or earlier, body exploration, whatever it may be. Had I been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom had I hurt? There's a lot of information in this, useful information for me to find out where this idea of if the world is behaving the way I want it to be, then my life is going to be okay. But if it's not behaving the way I want it to be, including in my sex life, then how can I be okay? Am I too demanding? Are my demands hurtful? This is just about placing down information on it, and then for me to be able to relate to it on a feeling level. I need to get things to my feeling level in order to get to empathy and compassion and ultimately forgiveness. Best definition I've ever heard of forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. That's something that I need to do. And I can do that not just with a sex inventory, but identifying where am I selfish, dishonest, and inconsiderate in life, and who am I hurting? Because I don't wake up on any given morning, as a general rule, thinking about wanting to do harm to someone. And if I have those feelings, it's important for me to talk to my sponsor about them. Be open about it in meetings that are safe. This, to me, is also an extension and a part of the fourth step. Then, what about the last part, which is sharing about a deep, dark secret in my life? I had not told anybody about that experience that I had in third grade in the bathroom until my first fourth step. I carried a lot of shame around that. And I was shaking when I told my sponsor that and a couple of other things that I had sworn I was never going to tell anybody. Sponsorship and picking a sponsor is something that I consider to be sacred territory. I was taught to do this by being acutely aware of somebody that I might seek, not just to get a sponsor so that I could say, I've got a sponsor, rather to find someone that had what I wanted. And when I found that, then I could adopt a principle for me, just speaking for me, that I want what that person has, and I'm willing to do what I'm instructed to do, casting out of my mind that I can't be told what to do, because mentorship and guidance is one of the greatest gifts that I have found that this program has given. So when I have that trusting relationship with someone, it's something that I check out. It's actually an early learning tool for me to be better in relationships in general, because I find a give and take. And I've seen some examples of what harm can happen with people if they don't have trust in that relationship, and then something that they may have shared that is sensitive gets exposed somehow, which is awful, an awful thing to have happen. So the entire impact of all the elements of step 4 is one of the most courageous, coupled then with the action of the 5th step, that I think that we can do for ourselves and for each other in recovery. I'll pass it back to Tim.
Thanks, Bob. So in the 5th step, we admit to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And I realize that I'm powerless over my mouth, so we don't have a whole lot of time for step 5 before the Q&A. But what I wanted to say was admitting to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs, for me, touched into the shame that Bob was talking about. Because when I was a kid, what I heard from adults was, How can you feel that way? You shouldn't feel that way. Don't feel that way. You should be ashamed of yourself. And it was always in that sort of progression. And I learned to be terrified of shame. And I learned that I was filled with shame for very good reasons. And so in the fifth step, admitting to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs seemed like a really tall order. And that was because I was dealing with a lower power rather than with a really huge higher power. Because as I've said, if I allow myself to do a fourth step inventory that is based on a commercial inventory, looking at assets as well as liabilities, I get to see that I have a higher power who enables me, if I want, to be kind and loving and generous and thoughtful, etc., all that really good stuff. And for so much of my life before and even into recovery, that was not who I was. In the midst of that, my higher power's opinion of me was sober. I did not have to get good in order to get better. I just had to show up. And if I allow myself to allow the higher power to love me in what I have determined to be the unlovablest parts of me, which is what my higher power does anyway, then I don't have the kind of fear and shame that prevented me from being able to do a searching and fearless moral inventory of myself that very first time. And I got to tell you that when people have come to me to share their fifth steps, I have never found myself either so shocked as to be clutching my pearls or feeling superior to the person. Instead, I find myself identifying with the powerlessness and unmanageability and consequences, most of which I've already experienced in my life or are just waiting to happen in my life, unless and until I can get beyond that stuff. So the fifth step for me actually is another really spiritual step because it affords me the opportunity to hear from another human being. I love you in the midst of this, which is what my higher power has been trying to have me hear all of my life. And it wasn't until I got into 12-step programs that I learned that was even a possibility, let alone that it's the default setting for a really humongous higher power in my life. I think we only have a couple more minutes left. So Bob, why don't you wrap this up and then we can do question and answer.
All right. So when, excuse me, when I prepare to to listen to a fifth step, or when I'm going to share one with Tim, I want to be sure that there's time to complete the process. Now, sometimes I've gotten some resentment lists. I'll have a copy of a fourth step when I'm hearing a fifth step from someone that are really thick. And when I see those, I know that I'm in store for a long day. So I want to be absolutely certain that I've dedicated enough time to be a thorough listener to the person, because this is sanctuary. It's sensitive when someone has the courage to share their fourth step. So I need to have maybe 4 to 5 hours available, plus 1 hour after the fourth step is completed. Because the language in the AA Big Book is very, very specific about what happens after the fourth step is shared. It says that we take an hour to contemplate what it is that we've shared. If anything comes to mind that has not been shared, we take the time to connect with the person that we've shared our fourth step with. And I'm available during that hour. Then at the end of the hour, I move forward from there. And we'll discuss those things when we're talking about step 6 and 7 after the lunch break. So I think it's now a good time to open this up for question and answer. And I really appreciate everybody's kind attention to the process this morning. And we're looking forward to carrying on after our break. So Q&A.
We've already had a question from Carolinda. She asked, what's the role of, what did I say the role of the higher power is? And for me, my higher power's first job is to be the one who has all power, so that I know, oh, wait a minute, that's not my job. Because if I can name the powerlessness of right now, I'm reminded that the AA Big Book says there is one who has all power. Tim is not it. Then in step 2, my higher power's job is restoration, not judgment, not condemnation, restoration. And the restoration is to wellness. Sanity comes from the Latin word sanus, which means integrity and wholeness and wellness and being put together well. And so my higher power's job in the second step is restoration. And then in the third step, my higher power's job is care. And for folks who come from goofy families, for me, coming from a goofy family, love masqueraded, well, let me put it this way, control masqueraded as love. And that was really confusing and really enticing. So to learn what it feels like to care and to be cared for and cared about was a tall order in my life. And to recognize I get to have, keeping it on me, I get to have a higher power who cherishes me. The word care and cherish, those words are related. I like the word cherish because it's more intense. I get to have a higher power who cherishes me in the midst of the mess. and who doesn't just put up with me holding her nose and looking the other way in spite of it. That was a huge spiritual awakening in my life. I have found that looking at my higher power's jobs as being the one who has all power, the one who restores, and the one who cares to be really helpful in terms of my recovery. Okay, so here is a question. Can the fifth step be broken down into more manageable pieces, such as 1 hour at a time so as not to overwhelm both participants? Limit to several items rather than the whole wad? Can you speak to this, pros and cons? I'm going to let Bob answer this first. I know my take on this, but I'm powerless over my mouth, so I'm going to let Bob do this.
I was just, whoa. I was just now trying to get into the participant questions. So I didn't hear the question. What was it? Can't hear you, Tim.
Can the fifth step be broken down into more
Thank you.
manageable pieces?
Sure. The fifth step can be done in any way that you decide with the person that you're hearing it from, or if you're doing a fifth step with your sponsor, how it's going to be managed. This is not a set of rules. It's a suggestion. I haven't done it that way personally myself because the ability to be in a contained, safe space and process all of the information is just more helpful to me. But I think that it's fine to arrive at however you want to set up hearing the fifth step.
And I would just add that I prefer to be able to do a fifth step in person. However, the constraints of the pandemic are such that I have adapted to be able to do fifth steps over Zoom or FaceTime or the phone. Of those three, I prefer the ability to have some video interaction. But hey, you know, whatever works. And that's what's wonderful about the program. It's that here are the steps that are suggested as a program of recovery. Here are some suggestions for working steps. That's why we're doing this workshop today. There was a question addressed to Father Time. Is the main difference between in a business inventory listing our personality assets? I would say yes. It was a revelation to me, and I really hated doing that damn Al-Anon blueprint for progress because it made me look at character assets. And the reason I hated it was that my brain had convinced me I had none. And lo and behold, that was not true. And by enumerating all these character assets, then I was really able to get the exact nature of my wrongs, because I did not have to act the ways that I acted. I had options. My brain was telling me I have no options. I'm a victim. I'm never going to do anything right. I'm not going to amount to anything, blah, blah, blah. And lo and behold, that was not true. And I could have acted in very different ways. And I get to have a higher power who loves me in the midst of those really unfortunate decisions and not just puts up with me in spite of them. That's amazing love. Bob.
Karen asks, can we explain a little bit more about uncover, discover, and discard? Okay, so many of us have heard about layers of the onion in the program. If I had uncovered everything that I know today about my past, childhood all the way through my drinking years, and even in recovery, and had that information when I did my first fourth step, I would not have wanted to drink, but I might have wanted to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. It just would have been too overwhelming. So the language in step 4 is made a fearless and searching moral inventory. I can relate to what Tim said about the way that he did the first one. But the uncover part is, in this process, the more I open myself up to this higher power that I identify, the more likely it is that layers of the onion are going to come off. And I never know when they're going to come off. Somewhat similar to I never know when that vulture at the bedpost is saying it'd be okay to take a drink today or eat sugar, which I'm not doing, and so on. So the uncovering part is to be ready, open, and prepared when new awarenesses come up. Now, here's an example for me. About 2.5 years ago, Beth and I, Beth is my life partner, my significant other, we're in couples counseling. Now, we made a decision to go to couples counseling in the early stages of our relationship when we were in the honeymoon stage. It's one of the best decisions we ever made, or I ever made, because both of us knew the background that we came from, and it was not about being successful in relationships. So we needed some coaching, we needed some help. And we found a wonderful therapist, and we have been able to uncover a lot of things with her. And it has been helpful to me then to take them to my sponsor and talk about them. So 2.5 years ago, I am in the shower in the morning, and she is getting ready. And I matter-of-factly said to her, you know what, I just had some flashbacks and memories about getting enemas as a kid that I didn't need. And she paused for a moment and she said, what do you think about talking to Diane about that in the session today? And I said, yeah, that's a good idea. So we go to therapy, and right near the end of the therapy session, maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes to go, I haven't shared anything about this, never crossed my mind. And Beth said to me, hey, do you remember what you said in the shower? What do you think about talking to Diane about this? And I said, yeah, sure. Wow, Diane, this morning I was in the shower and I described to her what I had described to Beth, and the entire room went black. And I felt like I was swaying. For a moment, I didn't know if I was dying. I couldn't see anything. I had no sight, no vision. And in this position of being in this presence of having admission out into the universe, which it turned out was specific to the therapist, I then began to hear from Beth and from Diane, is the therapist's name, Bob, we love you. Stay with the feeling. We love you. Stay with the feeling. And little bit slow, I began to come back and I could see some light. And then I think my eyes were open, but my vision was there then again. And from the bottom of my feet right up through my body, I had an explosion of emotion, crying like I had whooping cough. And she discussed with me, because I had been able to identify that I'd had sexual abuse in my background. This linked up some things that were uncovered. Then I discovered them. I got them to the feelings. I have learned to put myself into a safe environment with safe people and to be able to discuss things, because burying them or keeping them down is never going to do me any good because they're inside of me. Then I can go through the process of turning whatever it is over to my higher power, which I have the ability to make bigger and bigger and bigger if necessary. It was a truly spiritual experience. When I have had successes in life, oftentimes I need to be as willing to turn those over at the same time, because I will uncover, wow, I've been able to achieve this, or wow, I did this, or wow, I shared this experience in my work, something like that, and it was useful or helpful. And then I discover perhaps that I have too much ego surrounding it. So I can turn that over to get it into a better position. So I am not defaulting into that old mechanism of running the show or wanting the world to be the way I want it to be. Uncover, that's the authentic reality, discover how it applies to me, and then turn it over. Because in that process, I'm going to get back what I need when I'm honest about doing that. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Bob. Mina asks, how can I start to create my own HP when I haven't had one in my life? What a great question. That's awesome, Mina. My suggestion would be to begin to recognize areas of powerlessness in your life. For example, I mean, at night, when there's no moon and I'm out in the middle of nowhere, I have a real hard time seeing. That's some powerlessness. I think that in the 21st century, a lot of us have so taken for granted that all we need to do is flip a light switch and we're no longer powerless over the darkness, that I don't recognize that electric light is a power greater than me. And I would suggest that one option could be to recognize what powers there are in your life that you're not in charge of, but that you actually rely on. For example, how many of us today had to go to the well and lower a bucket and then raise it up and then carry water into the house in order to have access to water? That's a powerlessness. And I forget that because all I do is go into the kitchen or the bathroom and I turn the faucet and lo and behold, water comes. But I think that if I can analogize from I'm powerless over the darkness, there is a power greater than me that can overcome the darkness, and I'm not that power. I might be able then to get to a place of recognizing I can have a power greater than myself that cares for me. I can have a power greater than myself that's capable of restoring me to wellness. And I can choose to call that power good orderly direction, or the group of drunks, the great outdoors. For me, gratitude or death, or grace overcoming despair. The gift of desperation, whatever works. And keep trying. I believe that if you desire it and are open to it, it will happen. I hope that helps. Bob, do you want to take the question from Jerry on step 4?
Yes, Jerry asks, or says, the big book says, I ask myself why I have this fear. Is it because self-reliance has failed me? Then I ask God, what would he have me be? Talk a little bit more about the next parts of the fear inventory, just the list. One of the reasons that the list is so important for me is a lot of times I don't really know what I've been afraid of. And I don't know when fear is running the show. Once I begin to get real with the fears that I know about, then most of the time that defaults back into self-reliance is failing me. An example would be, I had another childhood trauma that caused me to be afraid of doctors. So for the longest time, I didn't go see a doctor. Then I came to find out in recovery that a lot of men particularly have fear of doctors, have trouble getting to the doctor. Well, my first journey through the steps, my sponsor would not hear the 5th step until I had a physical. And the great news that happened was I had a physical and it turned out I was just fine. Well, my fear-based mind translated that into, I don't need to have a physical again because I'm fine. So I didn't see a doctor again for a physical. I saw doctors, but only if there was a state of emergency, like I got a strep throat or I got the flu really bad one year when I didn't take a flu shot. So I had to see the doctor. But to go in for maintenance, for an inventory, a business inventory, I just didn't do. And I was an athlete in my youth, and I really banged up my knees very badly. And friends watched me walk around hobbling for years. And I was so afraid of surgery. Why? Because a couple of people that I knew that were in the program died on the operating table. These are 1 in a million examples, but this underlying fear was so big and it had roots in trauma from experiences in youth that I couldn't manifest getting to a doctor. I was operating on self-reliance that I was okay, a premise that was years old. I happen to know a doctor in the program, Dr. Jerry C., up in San Jose, California. And I knew his reputation and I'd had conversations with him a few times over the years. And I approached him at an international convention. And I asked him if I could talk to him. And I began to cry because, again, I felt shame around the fear that I had about not giving myself adequate self-care. So the great news was I changed the narrative by saying something to him. I was not based on self-reliance when I did that. I admitted It's interesting in the language of the first step that we admit what it is we have inside of us that we're powerless over. And by doing so, we are admitted into the fellowship of the Spirit. Admit, admit. And Jerry said, when you're ready, take a physical. So I did. And then I began to have an annual physical. And eventually I had conversations with him, and I had knee surgery. And then in July of 2019, I was in Greece, and I was walking up a hill on one of the Greek islands, and I felt a little short of breath. And I didn't think much of it. I sat down. I was carrying way too much weight. And it took me three times to get up the hill. Then I felt okay. And I didn't mention this to anybody except Beth, who was concerned, but she asked me if I was okay. And I said, yes, no reason to think any differently. So in a casual conversation with Jerry a month later, I talked with him about things not related to medicine at all, or to my having an appointment. And at the end of the conversation, it just occurred to me, I had not intended to say this to him. And then I told him about my experience of walking up the hill in Greece. And he said, this might be the most important conversation we've had. I want you to go see a cardiologist. Well, that took a little footwork to be able to get the appointment done. And I didn't actually see the cardiologist for a month. When I saw the cardiologist, I was on the operating table in less than 48 hours for 3 big, long stents to correct a 100% blockage in my right coronary artery. And 1 month later, a stent to correct an 89% blockage in my left coronary artery. Fear was a disabler. And it was also an enabler for me not to take action. So self-reliance is a nemesis to me all the time. And a basic list will create an environment where then I can begin to take actions that I may not yet believe in. I heard a speaker one time articulate that recovery is one person talking to another until the person that's having difficulties can identify and get information that can create a situation where they begin to take actions they do not yet believe in. I absolutely love that, and that's my experience. So fear is a big component of that. First a list, then an admission of self-reliance, and then taking action to do something about it. Thanks for that question, Jerry.
Okay, so Monique, can you talk more on recognition-oriented behavior with regard to how it's an indication of me running the show? I apologize, I'm not exactly sure what recognition-oriented behavior is, unless it has something to do with me doing things so other people can recognize me. I don't know. But with regard to running the show, I think that can, in my experience, that can be incredibly insidious. And if I am doing what I'm doing in order to get kudos from other people, it means that I'm basically operating from fear. And if I'm operating from fear, I don't have a big enough higher power. I have learned that the more afraid I feel, the smaller in practice my higher power is. And so I believe that the 12-step programs, with the emphasis on public anonymity, is a really wonderful spiritual truth that I need to be able to have the humility to be anonymous And when I act in ways that prevent other people from acknowledging my particular contribution, that means that I'm in a really healthy spiritual place, because there's a much better chance from my experience that what I'm doing without hidden expectations. And what I'm doing with clear motive, and not doing because I'm trying to manipulate someone else or some situation for my own benefit. I'm not sure if that answers the question. That said, if it doesn't, please help me to understand what the question is, and we'll get back to it. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both speakers. We're running up on our lunchtime break. And so at this time, Steve, if we have a slide for seventh tradition, I think that's the last thing, other than we're going to allow everybody to unmute yourselves. You'll be able to be in the room over the lunch break if you want to chat with each other. And Steve and I will be around, one of us. So if you need something, just shoot us a message in chat or reach out to us. So with that, let's make sure everybody has the ability to unmute at this time. I'm having a hard time getting there, so might be because we're sharing slides. There we are.
It might be that if you want to share, just unmute yourself, if you can.
You should be able to now. It looks like it's open.
Good. Well, I'm going to run and get some lunch.
Would you like to lead us out with a prayer, Tim? And
Okay, so let's have a moment of silence to remember folks inside and outside this room who are still sick. And I prefer to do the serenity prayer in the first person plural. So let's do that. God, grant us serenity to accept things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and wisdom to know the difference.
Amen.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for being here, folks. Okay.